So this is the part of the education that I got before my mother died in 1967, and consequently, 2 years later, my family moved to North Carolina. And so by the time I moved to North Carolina, because of the knowledge I had received in Chicago, I was hired to play at a church there, and I was doing top 40 band stuff, and I was doing all kind of stuff. And I was able to play anything I heard in all 12 keys. Because the way George Hunter would rehearse his big band, most often would be simply to have the guys who show up to pull out one chart and to play it in all 12 keys, to transpose it visually in all 12 keys, which is, it was an amazing kind of training. I don't know if anybody who does that today, but those guys were just amazing. So by the time I got back to Chicago, and I started working with a guy by the name of Vince Wilburn, who happened to be the nephew of Miles Davis, who had been in semi-retirement for about 4 or 5 years. He hadn't played a note. And Tom 84, who's the arranger for Earth, Wind & Fire, heard our group, invited us to the studio to do a demo recording for Maurice White to hear. And before Maurice White could hear that demo, Miles Davis heard it over the phone. Vince played him some songs, and there was a tune that I had written called Space. And Miles kept calling back and said, could you play that again? Play it again. And finally he asked for a cassette tape. This is before CDs, of course. And so he got the cassette, and he's just grooving on this music, and he finally asked if we would come and record that one song with him. So we get to New York, and the first thing that happened is we checked into the Sheraton Center, and I get a phone call from Miles, and he says, I'm sending a limo over, why don't you come over and hang out? And I said, what about the rest of the guys? He said, no, just you. It's like, okay. So I get there, and I ring the bell, and he's dressed in a black satin tank top and pants, and a black and red smoking jacket with velvet trim, just really cool with the glasses. And, you know, and so I get the Godfather kiss, you know, on each side, and he's surprised because I'm his height. He's a short man, and I'm surprised because I think he's, you know, his stature is 6 feet tall, and he says that when he heard my voice on the phone, he thought I was, you know, I was a big guy. So anyway, we kind of bonded just over that. So he invited me up, and we're sitting watching TV, and just talking about music and talking about family. So he asked me, you know, where are you from? And I tell him, and I tell him about my North Carolina experience. And he actually knows some of my friends in North Carolina because they were the backup band for Betty Davis, his ex-wife. So we kind of had this exchange, and so he goes, why don't you go to the piano and play something for me? So I went to the piano, and I, you know, played some things that I knew, kind of more in a bluesy, idiomatic expression. And so he was like a doctor who sort of diagnosed a musical deficiency, as it were. And he came around and to the piano, and I got up, and he said, no, just stay there. He puts his arms around me and reaches down to the keys, and he starts to play these. A lot of polychords. I could see exactly what he was doing because I understood the keyboard. I knew what it looked like, I knew what it felt like, but I'd never seen it done in that way, where he was layering, for example, a E-flat chord with an A bass. Very simple triad, but again, the bass redefined it. Or where he would play an F-sharp chord triad, leave the top note, and move the rest of the chord down a half step. So you get that kind of movement. And later on, he talked to me a lot about classical composers, classical music. Schoenberg, Ravel was one of his favorites, Stravinsky, and eventually he asked Gil Evans to mentor me as an arranger, as an orchestrator, because Miles had a passion for classical music, for orchestral music, and Gil was a little bit tired, and it was about maybe 3 years before he passed away. So he took the time to sit with me, show me scores. We had this really great exchange, and it was very enlightening, very enlightening. So that was the basis of my sort of journey with Miles Davis. And throughout those years, from the time that he reached over my shoulders, he sort of took on a musical father mentorship sort of relationship with me that lasted for our entire 9-year collaboration. The key word in all of this is mentorship and mentoring. In the same way that Captain Diet was a mentor for these great artists. And I started to think, what if these artists had been born in the 1980s, during the hip-hop era, when there was no early childhood education in music, where there was a de-emphasizing of the arts? What would have happened? So I started to, just for fun, to explore, well, Dinah Washington, for example, she might have been the cold-blooded MC Dinosaurus. And let's see, Joseph Jarman, who we all know and love, would have been MC JoJo Rhymeflow. Huh? Okay, so Fred Hopkins, how many knew Fred? Yeah, to know him was to love him. Really just fun guy. We toured together with David Murray's group. So I thought it would be fun to flip his name backwards, to make him MC Def Hip Hopkins. And we'll just do one more, or a couple more, maybe. Cliff Jordan, everybody knows Cliff Jordan, right? We used to call the guys who play jazz, really up until the 70s and 80s, I guess, the Cats. We used to refer, if a guy was really a great player, man, that's the cat, he's the cat. Or if we wanted to compliment another player, say, man, you're the cat. You know? Well, 1980s, of course, is the dog generation. So, Cliff J. Dog. And so finally, Nat King Cole, you know, who we know with this sultry, romantic sound, who was actually a piano player. He had no intention of being a singer, and he was sort of just thrusted upon that new career as a singer. And often he did a lot of sort of islandy kind of things. So I thought it might be fun to make him more of one of the Rasta rappers. Naughty Boy King Cooley. So I want to introduce you to what I consider to be the sort of, not the originators of hip hop, but the choices that they made influence the direction of the music, or the quality of the music, or the lack thereof, as we call it. And you'll probably be surprised at this choice. And the reason I call them the sort of the progenitors of this music is because we were in a recession during the 1980s, the early 1980s, 1979, 1980. And of course, a decision was made by this administration to cut the music programs in the schools. And so there was a diminishing of arts. But nevertheless, that coincided with an emergence of new technology for sampling. And so it was the sampling technology that kids turned to in lieu of the musical instruments. And so instead of playing instruments, they sampled instruments. And so, again, the choices that they made influence this whole new direction and generation. When Miles placed his hand on my shoulder and he diagnosed my personal development deficiencies and subsequently provided me with a systematic remedy which addressed the core issues, as we listen to the music, the hip-hop music, whether we like it or not, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, we can hear deficiencies in terms of the expansiveness of the direction, although a lot of artists now, even today as I speak, David Murray's in France doing orchestral arrangements for the group Roots, using classical music, actually transcribing classical music. And so this is going to be sort of the new wave of hip-hop that you're going to be hearing a lot more about soon. But it depends on who you're listening to and what you're listening to at the time. And if you're at the Jazz Links jam sessions on Wednesdays, on the second Wednesdays of every month, how many have not attended those? Okay, highly advised. If you're listening to those students, then you're hearing what could be the future of jazz, but those students are the exception and not the rule, and we have to change that. We have to make that more of the rule. If you listen to NPR now, you used to be able to turn on the radio and hear jazz at night. That's no longer there. Even the smooth jazz station, which I've seldom listened to when it was around, NUA, is now gone. We were born into a society. Hi, Diane. We were born into a society that supported artistic and cultural development in this country. And there was a time in this country when you could turn on the radio and you could hear James Brown, Stravinsky, Miles Davis, and Bob Marley all on the same station. And of course now everything is segmented, formatted, and in much of Europe you can still do that. You can still turn on the radio and hear a little bit of everything, and which is why I was able to tour in Europe for 3 times since October. That doesn't happen here in the States for us. So there's a reason for that. These are some of the names of some of the rap artists in the 80s that you might recognize. Kool Moe Dee, Ice Cube, MC Hammer, 50 Cent is called Nas. And what if conversely they had been born in a time when they worked with Captain Diet, when they had early childhood music education, where they explored all kinds of music, because Captain Diet didn't just deal with jazz. In fact, there was no jazz program per se at DuSable. This was something that he just took initiative to do. He just implemented it. Didn't ask for permission from the school board, anything. So my thing is that if they had grown up during that time, the biggest difference is that we'd probably know their real names. And there would be names like Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Wayne Shorter, and so on.